Hi, this is Dan Potter with the Houston Education Research Consortium, and thank you for joining us today as we talk about the next set of findings from our student mobility study. Today, looking specifically at the effects of student mobility on grade retention, dropout, and graduation. Before we get into the details of the findings, I first want to start by overviewing the research questions that will be covered in today's presentation. We have two research questions that will be guiding our overall presentation. The first one being, how is student mobility related to A, being retained in ninth grade, B, on-time high school graduation, and C, high school dropout? Additionally, we have a second set of research questions that will be looking at, does the effect of mobility on these outcomes vary by the number of moves a student makes, student characteristics, and finally, the academic performance of the school to which the student moves. So what did we find? First, we found that student mobility is related to an increase in the likelihood of ninth grade retention. We found that student mobility is related to a decrease in the likelihood of on-time graduation. And finally, we found that mobility was related to an increase in the likelihood of dropping out. Additionally, we found that mobility moves that took place in earlier grades oftentimes were compounded and contributed to additional negative effects of moving in the later years, so middle school and high school. While we did see these compounding effects of mobility, we noted that these effects were similar across student characteristics. So that is to say, whatever type of student was moving, it was bad for that student. And then finally, we noted that while most mobility does tend to have a negative effect, for those students that were moving to a higher performing school, that movement to a higher performing school tended to work out okay for the student. So let's hop into these findings in a little bit more detail. First, let's cover some key terms. So when we talk about retention, we are specifically referencing being retained in ninth grade. So these would be individuals who were in ninth grade one year, and then they appear in ninth grade again the following year. When we say dropped out of high school, we are talking about students who are coded at some point as being dropped out during one of the years in which they were in high school. Graduated on time, we're referencing students who are in ninth grade in a particular year and then graduated 4 years later. So an example of that would be a ninth grade student in 2013-14 that graduated in 2016-17. And then finally, when we're talking about school year mobility, we are talking about students who are moving during the school year. Do note that as we talk about these results, our findings are going to focus on this school year mobility. However, we looked at analyses considering summer mobility and found similar patterns of results. In terms of who we looked at for this analysis, we conducted this analysis using 5 cohorts of Texas ninth graders. We used these cohorts of students because the study focused on those secondary or high school outcomes. For these cohorts, we looked backwards and forwards to the first grade and 12th grades to sort of get a full picture of what the student's educational career looked like. And in doing so, in terms of looking forward and backward, we were able to track school year and summer moves that occurred in elementary, middle, and high school. All right, so let's look at our findings in a little bit more detail. Research question 1A asked whether or not mobility increased the likelihood of grade retention in ninth grade. What we found was that for students who only moved in elementary school, there was no association between their mobility and grade retention in ninth grade. However, for students that were mobile in middle school or students that were mobile during their ninth grade year, for both of these types of students, we noted an increase in the percent of them that were retained. So an increased likelihood in grade retention based upon mobility. Research question 1B, looking at the association between mobility and on-time high school graduation, noted that mobility in middle school or high school decreased the chances of on-time graduation. Once again, we noted that mobility in elementary school was not associated with on-time high school graduation. Research question 1C, looking at the association between mobility and high school dropout status, one more time, we noticed that mobility in middle school or high school increased the chance of high school dropout, whereas mobility during the elementary school years was not associated with high school dropout. Turning our attention now to research question 2, where we re-examined these initial sets of findings, but this time looking to see perhaps if there were some more nuanced findings, nuanced associations in the data. For research question 2A, we were interested in seeing whether or not there was a sort of cumulative component to mobility. That is to say, if I moved only in high school, did that impact my outcomes differently than if I moved in high school, middle school, and potentially elementary school? And what we found was that indeed, for mobility that took place in high school, while we already noted as part of research question number 1 that this type of mobility was associated with negative outcomes, we notice here that this negative association increases, at least for 9th grade retention and high school dropout, if that student also moved earlier in their educational career. And we can see there that moving in middle and high school increases the likelihood of dropping out, as well as if the student moved in elementary, middle, and high school. For research question 2B, we were wondering, okay, now that we've seen how mobility is associated with these student outcomes, is mobility associated with student outcomes similarly for different student groups? That is to say, might mobility matter differently for students who are free reduced price lunch, limited English proficient, or perhaps from a historically disadvantaged racial ethnic group? And so part of this investigation looked at these different subgroups, and what we found was that mobility appeared to matter relatively similar for all students. And so as we see here in this graph, the probability of graduating on time from high school was the same for free reduced price lunch students, whether or not they moved, for limited English proficiency students, whether or not they moved, and for Black or African American students, once again, whether or not they moved. And these results point to mobility having a similar effect for all these groups across this spectrum. For research question 2C, our final piece for this presentation, we wanted to know whether or not all types of moves were the same. And one way that we could compare these moves were to look and see which moves might be considered upward moves, lateral moves, or downward moves. In order to make this determination, we looked to see whether or not students were moving to a better performing school, a similar performing school, or a lower performing school. And we determined performance based upon STAR test scores. What we see is that for those students that move to a better school, we actually see this upward move associated with a similar level of on-time high school graduation as if this student had never moved in high school. In contrast, for students that moved to a lateral school or made a lateral move, or for those students that moved downward, this would be going from one school to a lower performing school, for both of these groups, lateral and downward, the impact of this move was negative, decreasing the likelihood that this student would graduate from high school on time. Now, while this is a seemingly positive note to end on, that being that upward mobility can actually have a positive, or at least a mitigated effect on students graduating from high school, what we'll note in conclusion is that while we do see that pattern, upward moves leading to as if the student had not moved at all, we see that a minority of students is actually making upward moves. And in fact, only about 1 in 5 students who moved during their high school years were ending up going to a better school than the one they were departing. So what does this all mean? Our key takeaways. Well, first off, we can reflect that mobility matters. It matters for 9th grade retention, it matters for high school dropout, and it matters for on-time high school graduation. Perhaps not surprisingly, given its temporal proximity to our outcomes, but we did note that high school mobility and middle school mobility were most problematic for these outcomes. While elementary school did not appear to have an independent association with some of these later outcomes, we did note that students that were moving in elementary school, in middle school, and in high school, this compounded negative effect led to even greater detriment to later academic outcomes. Finally, while we did note that moving to higher performing schools can mitigate the negative effects of mobility, we would also add that few students make these types of moves, and perhaps most importantly, these students did not perform better than students that did not move. They simply performed similar to students that did not move. Thank you for taking your time today to learn from us a little bit about the associations between student mobility and outcomes. If you do have any questions, feedback, or suggestions, please feel free to reach out to me, Dan Potter. Here is my email address on the screen, or Corey Straub. His email address also appears on the screen. Also, please be sure to follow our YouTube's page so that as new results are coming out and being shared, they are making their way to your inbox. Thank you again for joining today, and stay tuned for future findings from our research.